winter nights, it was just an old woman, her scuffed piano, and the snow pressed against the windows. She would set a bowl of food on the porch and close the door. Then a thin bobcat began waiting at the edge of the light, eating only when her hands moved across the keys. The house stayed silent until the first note rang out and the porch boards answered each step. The piano came with the house, a heavy walnut upright that leaned against the northern wall like a tired relative. In winter, the keys felt cool and faintly dusty, and when I pressed one, the whole frame answered with a soft, wooden sigh. I moved in after my husband passed, thinking silence might help, but the house never stayed truly quiet. Most evenings I played after dinner, when the dishes were drying on the rack and the last light slid off the snow behind the tree line. A single lamp by the window, the ticking clock, the faint whir of the old fridge that was my little orchestra. Yet, some nights, an extra sound joined in, low and irregular, as if the house itself had learned to breathe along with the music. The first time I noticed it, a plank on the back porch creaked exactly on the downbeat of an old hymn. I stopped playing, and the sound stopped too. My fingers hovered above the keys, my heart suddenly louder than the clock. I laughed at myself, blamed it on the settling house, and tried again. On the next chord, the same board complained, slow and deliberate. By then, the hairs on my arms had risen. A draught brushed my ankles, colder than the air near the window. I told myself it was just January in an old place, seams shrinking in the frost. Still, the sensation of being watched clung to the back of my neck, the way it used to when a congregation fell silent before I played the first note on Sunday mornings. After that night, the pattern returned. Not every song, not every evening, but often enough that I began to glance toward the dark glass of the kitchen door between phrases. More than once I had the stubborn feeling that if I stood up too quickly, whatever was just out of sight would scatter like dust in sunbeams. My chest tightened, half with unease, half with curiosity. One snowy afternoon, I walked out to fetch logs from the woodpile and saw faint marks near the porch steps. They weren't clear, just impressions in the drift where the powder had crusted and broken. For a moment I thought of boot prints, but the spacing was wrong, the shape too rounded, too soft. When I bent closer, a cold prickle ran across my scalp, as if the sky had leaned in with me. I straightened, immediately annoyed with myself. At my age, I knew better than to let my imagination run off on its own. Wind moved things. Snow slumped. Old houses groaned in their bones. I told myself all of that in a firm, teacherly tone, the same voice I'd once used on nervous choir altos. Even so, I carried the logs in faster than usual, feeling strangely relieved when the door clicked shut. That evening, I almost picked up the phone to call my neighbour Harold, just to mention the odd marks and the porch creaks. I even dialed the first 3 numbers before hanging up. He'd just joke that I needed company or better insulation. And maybe he'd be right. So instead, I sat back at the piano, placed my fingers on the keys and paused, listening. The house held its breath. Days slid by in their small routines. Coffee from the percolator, crossword by the window, calls with my sister in Arizona. Yet under it all ran that thin, bright thread of awareness. Certain hours felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm, though the sky stayed pale and harmless. Around dusk especially, the living room seemed to gather its shadows closer, waiting for me to open the floorboard. One Friday, the creak on the porch came before I played a single note. It was quick but deliberate, followed by the faintest scratch against wood. Not harsh enough to be alarming, but too precise to dismiss. My pulse jumped. I sat completely still, hands folded in my lap, listening so hard that my ears began to ring. The clock on the wall ticked its approval of my stillness. I rose halfway from the bench, tempted to snap the light on above the back door, to flood the yard with a sudden wash of yellow and prove there was nothing there. The habit of a lifetime faced the unknown directly pushed at my shoulders. But another feeling, just as old, tugged me back down. A quiet sense that if I rushed it, whatever hovered beyond the glass would simply vanish. Mystery broken like thin ice. So I stayed where I was, half turned toward the dark kitchen, breathing slowly. My fingers returned to the keys almost on their own. I chose something gentle, an old lullaby my mother loved, and let the first notes drift through the room. On the third measure, the porch complained again, in time with my left hand, as if answering the bass line. A shiver ran down my spine. Not entirely unpleasant. By the end of that song, nothing dramatic had happened. No doors flew open. No windows rattled. Yet when I finally rose to make tea, I did it with the settled knowledge that my evenings were no longer mine alone. Something out there knew my routine well enough to match it. Step for step, chord for chord. It was not frightening. Not yet. But it was undeniably, softly strange. The next morning, pale light spilled over the drifts like milk, and I told myself I would not go looking. I made oatmeal, washed the bowl, and lingered far too long by the sink. Finally, with a sigh that fogged the glass, I reached for my coat. Curiosity, it seemed, still had a stronger grip on me than the arthritis in my fingers. The air bit my cheeks as I stepped onto the porch. Overnight, the wind had dragged powder into soft waves around the steps. At first I saw only the usual, my own tracks to the woodpile, the neighbour's snowplough trail on the lane. Then my eye caught a line of small depressions hugging the side of the house, evenly spaced, as if something had paced there. Undecided, beneath last night's stars. They weren't deep, but they were distinct, rounded impressions with a hint of separation at the front. The way fingers show in damp clay. I followed them as far as the corner, my heartbeat strangely loud in the cold. Where the prints met the porch, the boards themselves bore faint smudges, as if something had paused with weight balanced carefully. Listening in, another shudder rolled through me, more from recognition than fear. I knelt to touch one of the marks on the wood. The surface felt no different, dry and splintered beneath my glove. Still, my skin tightened along my arms, as if expecting warmth to rise from that spot. "It's nothing," I muttered, letting my breath plume. Just life passing through like it always has. My own voice sounded thin, a stranger's voice borrowed for reassurance. Back inside, the house seemed too warm, too still. I left my coat on longer than necessary, palms pressed to the pockets as if holding on to something invisible I'd carried in. Twice I moved toward the phone to call Harold, and twice I stopped. The explanation in my head, something walks around my porch only when I play, felt flimsy the moment I shaped it. Maybe yesterday's timing had been pure coincidence. That afternoon, Harold stopped by on his own with a jar of chili and a handful of mail the postman had left at his place by mistake. His boots left clean prints on the rug, ordinary and square. "You getting any critters out back?" he asked casually, glancing through the kitchen window. Saw some tracks near the lane this morning. Looked like something with short legs and a big attitude. I felt a tight flutter in my chest. Probably just foxes, I said, too quickly. He shrugged, unconcerned, and started talking about the forecast, about a possible storm rolling in by Sunday. But his offhand remark tugged at a memory, a mottled shape once glimpsed near the tree line years ago. Tufted ears and watchful eyes. I pushed it aside, refusing to label the thought. Names made things too real. That evening, I almost broke my own pattern. I turned on the television after dinner, let the hum of the news fill the room, and told myself I'd skip playing for once. My left hand tingled, tired from chopping vegetables. Yet as the anchors moved from weather to politics, the urge to cross the room and lift the piano's fullboard grew. A slow pull, like the tide. I finally gave in and muted the TV. The moment my fingers brushed the keys, a faint sound answered from outside, a soft thump, followed by the skitter of something brushing the porch rail. My heart kicked. I froze, every muscle at attention. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own breath catch, the way it had in childhood when I hid during hide and seek and someone passed by inches away. I almost snapped on the porch light again, my thumb resting on the switch. But a strange respect had taken root in me, some sense that this was not a thing to be startled like a raccoon in the trash. Instead, I eased back to the bench and chose a slow waltz, the one piece my hands still knew without thinking. The first notes drifted, and on the fourth, that familiar board answered with a long, creaking sigh. Halfway through, I looked up and saw it, a darker shape against the snow, just beyond the edge of the porch light's reach. Not large, not small, its outline blurred by the glass and the moving curtain. What caught me were the ears tipped in shadows, like tiny paintbrushes lifting from the surface of night, and the suggestion of a short, thick tail switching once, in time with the rhythm. My throat tightened. I blinked, and for a moment the shape seemed to fold back into the dusk. Had I imagined the ears? Had a passing cloud shifted the light? A familiar unease stirred in my stomach. Old houses, old minds, old eyes, they could all play tricks. I intentionally stumbled on a chord just to hear something human and clumsy in the room, then took a deep breath and played on. When the song ended, the porch fell silent. I stood, moved slowly toward the kitchen, and rested my palm on the cold glass of the back door. The yard lay quiet, the snow smooth once more, as if no foot, human or otherwise, had ever pressed into it. Only the faint line of those earlier prints remained along the foundation, like a sentence half written, waiting for a reader brave enough to finish it. That night in bed, I listened for every creak and groan the house had to give. Somewhere near midnight, a soft tapping reached my ears. 4 beats. A pause. 4 beats again. Almost like someone knocking along with an unheard tune. My eyes stung with fatigue, and I told myself the heating pipes were just adjusting to the cold. Still, I lay awake far longer than usual, humming that waltz silently into the dark. Morning brought clear skies and a message on my phone from my sister, asking how the little retreat in the woods was treating me. I typed back about snow and soup and reading by the fire, leaving out the part where the house seemed to have acquired its own invisible accompanist. Even as I hit send, a quiet certainty settled in my chest. Whatever circled these walls at dusk had begun to learn my songs. And somehow, I suspected, I had begun to learn its timing too. It was Harold who finally put a name to it. He came over 2 days later, stomping snow from his boots and squinting down at the porch. "You've got yourself a regular visitor," he said, tracing one print in the frost. "That's no fox." He straightened slowly, giving me a look that was half concern, half small-town curiosity. My stomach fluttered in that now familiar way. "What do you think it is?" I asked, though the answer was already forming at the back of my mind, built from old field guides and half-remembered sightings near the tree line. Saying it out loud felt like crossing a quiet threshold I had been standing beside for weeks. "Bobcat," he said simply. "Seen 'em around for years. They don't usually come this close unless they've got a reason. You been leaving food out. Mags." His tone wasn't accusing, just practical, as if we were discussing raccoons in the trash instead of something that moved like mist along the edge of the woods. I shook my head, almost defensively. "Of course not. I barely keep myself fed." Yet even as I answered, a small truth tugged at me. I hadn't offered food, but I also hadn't rushed to break the pattern. I'd left the light off, kept my hands on the keys, made room for whatever paced outside to keep returning. Sometimes permission is given simply by not saying no. After Harold left, the house felt more crowded with meaning. Now that the word existed between us, every creak and shadow carried extra weight. I wandered into the pantry and stood, staring at the shelves, beans, rice, oats, a small packet of chicken I'd meant to turn into soup. We tried everything. People always say in stories, but I hadn't tried a single concrete thing yet. Only listening. That evening, I moved slowly, as if performing a quiet ritual. I thawed the chicken, cut it into modest pieces, and placed them in a shallow metal pan. Stepping onto the porch, I set it just beyond the top step, where the shadows from the eaves lay deepest. The air nipped at my cheeks, and something in me recognized that I had just stepped over an invisible line between watching and inviting. Back inside, my hands went to the piano almost on their own. I sat for a moment with my fingers resting on the cool keys, thinking of how easily a small kindness can slide into interference. Was I helping? Or teaching it to lean on me? In the end, I chose the lullaby that had started all this. The one tune that still felt like a prayer instead of a performance, and let the first notes float into the dim room. At first, there was only the house, the faint hiss of the heater, the clock's steady tick, the soft scuff of my slippers on the floor. Then, on the second pass through the melody, came the sound I'd been half expecting and half dreading. Step, pause, step, each one landing in gentle time with my left hand. The porch board that always complained offered its familiar, answering creak like a bass note. I did not look up. It felt important not to turn this into a staring match. Instead, I kept the rhythm steady, careful not to let excitement rush me. A faint scrape followed, metal touching wood as the pan shifted. Then came softer noises, almost lost beneath the music, a careful nudge, a small bone tapped, a quiet, deliberate chewing. The house seemed to lean toward those sounds as if they were part of the song. When the lullaby ended, I slid into a simple hymn rather than lifting my hands. I played the waltz after that, stretching the moment as long as felt reasonable. Through each piece, the gentle eating continued, unhurried, polite. Only when I finally allowed silence to fall did the porch answer with one last, decisive step and then settle into stillness. When I peered out later, the pan shone bare in the dim light, The next night, curiosity won over caution. I set the pan out at the same hour, but did not sit at the piano. Instead, I washed dishes slowly, letting the clink of porcelain and rush of water fill the room. The house felt off-kilter, as if I'd skipped an important line in a familiar hymn. I checked the porch twice. The meat lay as I had left it, slowly frosting over in the cold. Nothing ventured close enough to disturb a single piece. By morning, the pan was still untouched. A small metal moon sunk in snow. A few crow tracks ringed it, but even they had left the contents alone. As I carried it back inside, a knot tightened under my ribs. For all my lofty ideas about keeping wild things wild, it seemed I had already helped draw a line in this animal's mind. Music meant safe food. Silence meant caution. Whether I liked it or not, I was now part of its map. That evening, I slid the pan into its usual place and, after a longer pause than usual, opened the full board. The first chord felt like an apology. It rang through the room with a clarifying honesty I couldn't avoid. Outside, almost at once, came the answering tread. The board's soft complaint. The quiet scrape of metal nudged just so. Later, when people would say, "We tried everything," I would know that in my case the truth was stranger. Up to that point, all I had really tried was silence and song, and the wild heart at my back door had chosen song. Curiosity, once fully awake, is hard to put back to sleep. Between weather updates and calls from my sister, I found myself researching quietly articles on local wildlife, notes about habits and territories. The more I read about bobcats, the more peculiar our arrangement seemed. They were solitary, careful, not known for tying their mealtimes to the habits of one retired woman and her aging piano. One grey afternoon, the tuner from town, a lanky man named Devon, came to service the instrument. He wore a wool cap and carried a leather case that looked older than both of us. As he opened the front panel, dust puffed out, carrying with it the faint, sweet smell of old varnish and something like mouse nests long gone. "This old girl's seen some winters," he said fondly, running a finger along the strings. I watched him work. Small hammer tapping, ear cocked. "Did you know the man who owned the house before me?" I asked. The realtor said he'd been here a long time. Devon smiled without looking up. Oh yes, Mr. Lambert, quiet fellow, mostly taught lessons to half the kids in town, though Sunday afternoons, windows open, you could hear scales all the way down to the crossroads. He kept this piano in nice shape, considering. His hand paused on one string that sang out sharper than the rest. He used to say this room had the best echo in the county. I thought of the way my notes seemed to hover near the kitchen door, of how sound travelled out into the cold. Did he live alone? I asked. Far as I know, Devon replied. Never married. But he talked about the woods like they were family. Said the deer knew his schedule. Swore something used to sit just outside the pool of light and listen when he played late. He chuckled softly. I figured it was his way of saying he was never lonely. A faint chill slid down my arms, unrelated to the draft under the door. I pictured a younger man at this same bench, hands surer than mine, playing into the dark while something watchful lingered just beyond the window's reflection. Did he mention what it was? I asked. Devon shrugged. He hinted once. Said there was a mottled shadow with tufted ears that kept him honest with his practicing. My harshest critic. He called it. Then he tightened one last string and closed the panel with a firm, satisfying thump. There. She'll hold a tune better for you now. After he left, the house felt newly aware of itself, as if the tightened strings had drawn its bones into sharper focus. I walked slow circuits through the rooms, fingers trailing over door frames, picture hooks, the worn banister. Everywhere I looked, evidence of Mr. Lambert lingered, faint marks on the wall where sheet music once leaned. A nail above the piano where a metronome might have hung like a pendulum, keeping time with the seasons. That night, when I sat down to play, the first chord rang clearer, richer, a hint of brightness glinting in the low notes. The response from outside came almost at once, a soft step, then another. Weight spread carefully. My chest tightened, half with anticipation, half with an odd sense of continuity, as if I were slipping into a role someone else had written long ago. We're just borrowing each other's routines, I murmured. Barely audible. I played one of the simpler student pieces, imagining small fingers once stumbling over the same phrases. Mr. Lambert guiding them patiently. As the melody flowed, the now familiar sounds from the porch joined in, measured and calm. The pan scraped once, then fell still, as if our guest were as content with the tune as with the food. Over the following days, I began to test the edges of our arrangement. Some evenings I started with a jaunty folk tune instead of the lullaby. On those nights, the first steps on the porch came later, uncertain, as if whoever waited outside was pacing in the dark, undecided. When I drifted back to the softer pieces, the rhythm of movement settled, matching the gentle arcs of the music. Harold, of course, had his opinions. When I finally confessed the pattern to him over coffee, he frowned, stirring his mug until the spoon chimed against the sides. "You're training it," he said, "associating your house and your playing with food. That's not always a kindness. What happens when you go visit your sister for a month, or if you get sick and can't play?" His words landed heavier than he meant them to. The thought of my hands failing me, of stiffness or tremor stealing the only language that still felt fully mine, made my stomach clench. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I can't unknow what I know now. There's a creature out there that has decided my music means safety enough to approach. I can't pretend it doesn't exist. Wild things are supposed to stay wild." Harold reminded me gently, "Maybe what you owe it is distance, not dinner." That night, I tried again to set the pan out without playing. The air felt thin, as if the house were holding its breath. I sat on the sofa with a book, pretending not to listen. The clock ticked, the fridge hummed, and somewhere in the distance an owl called once, twice. No steps, no creaks. When I finally gave up and approached the piano, a guilty heat climbed my neck. The moment my fingers brushed the keys, the familiar response came, a careful tread, a board's soft complaint, the small shift of metal on wood. I snorted at myself quietly. "So much for noble intentions," I whispered. In truth, I wasn't sure anymore who was conditioning whom. I only knew that, night by night, the line between obligation and companionship had begun to blur. Word travels quickly in small towns, even when no one means for it to. It was Harold, again, who let slip at the hardware store that I had a cat with spots coming by. By the next Sunday, Pastor Elaine was asking with amused concern if I needed someone from the wildlife office to take a look. Her tone was light, but her eyes searched my face for signs of worry. "I'm being careful," I assured her, sipping weak coffee in the fellowship hall. "It stays outside. I don't approach it. I don't even look it in the eye." That last part was mostly true. My glimpses remained angled through reflections, shapes caught at the edge of vision as I pretended to focus on the sheet music. One of the younger men from the congregation, a volunteer with the county conservation group, overheard and frowned. "You really shouldn't be feeding it at all," he said respectfully. "Predators that lose their fear of humans get into trouble. Not always their fault, but they pay the price." His words dropped into my chest like small stones. At home that afternoon, I sat at the piano without lifting the floorboard. The room felt oddly naked, the keys exposed like teeth in a silent mouth. The pan on the counter, scrubbed clean and shining, seemed to accuse me with its very emptiness. I turned it over in my hands, thinking of all the stories people told about doing right by wild things and getting it wrong anyway. We tried everything. Those stories often began. But usually, everything meant actions they understood: fences, traps, phone calls to agencies, stern lectures to neighbours. No one ever listed the quiet experiments, the nights spent simply listening. I realised, not without unease, that my list of everything had grown long. Songs swapped, schedules shifted, lights left off on purpose, choices made, not just habits followed. One evening I decided to split the difference. I set the pan further from the house, at the edge where the porch steps met the yard. Then, instead of sitting down to play immediately, I waited at the kitchen table, fingers laced around a mug of cooling tea. The silence felt brittle, as if one wrong move would crack it. Eventually, a faint rustle came from the dark snow disturbed, weight transferring slowly. I stood halfway, heart beating at my throat. If the creature came closer without the music, perhaps it had begun to tolerate the house itself, not just the song. Maybe, in time, it could learn to hunt more confidently and forget this odd dependency. Maybe I could call that progress. The sounds paused, resumed hesitantly, then stopped altogether. In the end, the pan remained untouched. The next night, I moved the pan back to its usual place and played as I always had. The response was immediate and calm. Steps sure. Movements small and efficient. It felt less like luring and more like meeting someone halfway along a path you both knew by heart. Yet Harold's words echoed whenever I paused between pieces. Whenever the creaks ceased and the night closed in again, I started keeping a notebook on the piano lid, recording what I played and when the sounds came. Tuesdays, it seemed, drew the earliest visits. Perhaps because the road was quiet and the sky often clear. Slow hymns and lullabies drew longer. More relaxed eating. Anything too loud or complex made the steps falter. More than once, a sharp chord of frustration on my part caused a sudden retreat. The board complaining with a startled finality before falling still. In town, opinions divided neatly, as opinions often do. Some folks thought the whole thing charming, a gently eccentric story about the widow on the hill and her musical neighbour. Others worried aloud about pets and safety, about inviting trouble up to the back door. No one offered a practical solution that didn't involve severing the tie entirely. Just stop feeding it, they said, as if that would be as easy as turning off a radio. I didn't tell them that on the nights I tried, sleep grew thin and jagged, like sheets gone to rags. I'd lie awake imagining ribs under mottled fur, the disciplined stillness of a hunter refusing easier paths out of some hard-earned instinct. I'd listen for steps that never came, as if absence itself were a kind of noise. In those hours, the ethics in my head tangled with something softer and less logical in my chest. One afternoon, a flyer appeared on the bulletin board at the grocery, living with predators. A conservation group was hosting a talk at the library about coexisting safely with wildlife. I circled the date, tore off one of the little phone number tabs at the bottom, and tucked it into my pocket. It felt like the grown-up thing to do, the responsible next step in whatever this had become. The storm they'd predicted arrived with more patience than drama. First a fine grit of snow, then heavier flakes, then wind that found every crack in the siding. The power flickered twice by afternoon, and by evening it had given up entirely, plunging the house into a hush broken only by the moaning of trees and the occasional thump of shifting branches on the roof. I lit candles in mismatched holders, their small flames stitching golden patches into the dark. The piano looked different by candlelight, its walnut surface glowing softly. Keys striped in amber and shadow. Without the hum of the refrigerator and heater, every sound felt magnified. The tick of the mantel clock was a metronome all its own, steady, unbothered, out of habit. I glanced toward the back door. Snow drove sideways past the glass, turning the world beyond into a moving blur. The idea of setting food out in that weather felt almost cruel. Any scent would be whipped away, any warmth stolen instantly. Yet the thought of doing nothing, of sitting warm and fed while some creature waited under a fir tree somewhere, tugged at me like an insistent, familiar melody. My hands ached more than usual, knuckles swollen from the sudden drop in temperature. I flexed them slowly, remembering Harold's question. What happens if you can't play? The storm had given me one answer already: no electric lights, no recorded music. All that remained was what my fingers could manage on their own. And tonight even that felt uncertain. Still, I put on my boots and coat, balancing the pan carefully as I stepped onto the porch. Wind clawed at my scarf, and snow stung my cheeks. I set the pan just inside the windbreak, where at least some of the storm's fury was blunted. When I straightened, a gust nearly tipped me sideways, and a spike of pain shot through my right wrist. I had to grip the railing with both hands on the way back in. Once inside, I hesitated. Without power, the house felt oddly like it had in my childhood: dim, quiet, analog. I could have gone to bed early, burrowed under extra blankets, and let the night rush past. Instead, I found myself lighting 2 more candles and placing them on the piano. Their light pooled across the keys, inviting and impossibly gentle. I chose the simplest piece I knew, one that required little stretch from my tired fingers. The first notes slipped out, softer than usual, without the backing hum of electricity. The storm answered, rattling the window in an uneven rhythm. For a while I heard nothing else. Then, threading through the roar of wind, came the faint, familiar complaint of the porch board, right on cue with my left hand. It felt wrong and right at the same time. Wrong to be pleased that something had braved this weather to keep our odd appointment. Right that the pattern held even when so much else did not. I played on, letting the music be as much for myself as for the unseen listener. Each chord warmed my stiff joints a little. Each phrase a small refusal to surrender to the heaviness pressing in from the world outside. At one point, a loud crack split the night, a branch giving way under ice. Tumbling to the ground, I flinched, fingers stumbling. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The steps, the eating sounds, even the wind seemed to hold back. My heart rattled in my chest like something trying to escape. I was suddenly aware of my age, of the thin layers of wood and glass between me and the rawness out there. Slowly, deliberately, I found the melody again. Not the lullaby this time, but a simple, steady progression of chords I used to teach to nervous beginners. Left hand alone at first, then right, then both together. As the pattern re-established itself, the porch answered once more. Not hurried, not anxious, just that measured, almost respectful movement, as if whoever waited in the dark had chosen to trust the return of the tune over the threat of the broken branch. The next morning, the world lay heavy and muted under a fresh quilt of snow. Power was still out. My breath puffed white in the kitchen. When I opened the back door, the cold rushed in like a reprimand. The pan lay exactly where I'd left it, turned at a slight angle, its contents gone so cleanly that not even a smear remained. Nearby, the snow held a neat series of prints, leading toward the tree line. Unhurried, I traced one with my gaze, noting the rounded shape, the slight drag where a short tail might have brushed. Something in my chest loosened. We had both survived the night-aging woman. Cautious predator. House with its rewired routines. Not because I had done everything right or wise, but because, in the middle of my own fear, I had chosen to keep playing. As winter loosened its grip, the patterns shifted again. Snowbanks shrank, revealing the matted brown grass beneath, and the fierce hunger in the air seemed to ease. I saw fewer tracks near the house, more farther out, crossing the field where mice and rabbits had begun their own restless circuits under the thawing ground. I expected to feel relieved. Instead, the quiet evenings sat oddly on my shoulders. I still played. Of course. Habit is hard to break. And music had been my companion long before any bobcat took notice. But on the nights when no step answered from the porch, a small, foolish part of me felt stood up. I caught myself listening for absences as much as for sounds. We tried everything. I wrote once in the notebook, meaning something different now. I'd tried to wean our visitor off this strange dependence, moving the pan gradually farther from the house over several weeks. Some nights it followed, others it did not. Eventually, I began to taper the portions, trusting that as prey returned, so would its instincts. The pan grew lighter. The music remained. One evening in early spring, I made a small experiment. I set no food out at all. Instead, I opened the back door for a moment, letting the cool, damp air wash through the room, carrying smells of wet earth and old leaves. Then I closed it, sat at the piano, and played anyway. No reward, no transaction, just the old lullaby that had become our shared language. Halfway through, there it was, a soft tread on the porch, a brief pause right at that one complaining board. No scrape of metal, no click of teeth against the pan, just presence, measured and calm, before retreating back into the dimness. It felt, unexpectedly, like being visited for my own sake, not for what I had. I laughed under my breath, surprised by how moved I was by so small a gesture. As days grew longer, the visits became occasional punctuation marks instead of nightly sentences. A glimpse of mottled fur at the edge of the yard at dusk. The faintest reflection of amber eyes in the window when I leaned too close to the glass. Once, in the full light of afternoon, I caught sight of our neighbour crossing the far field. Head low, body flowing over uneven ground with effortless, muscular grace. It did not look up. That felt important. In town, talk moved on to other topics: spring cleanup, potholes, the early return of bluebirds. My odd arrangement faded from gossip, becoming just another one of those small, local stories that people forget to retell unless prompted. Only Harold, when he dropped off mail or shared a pot of coffee, still asked occasionally, "You getting any music requests from your friend?" His tone was lighter now, less worried. "We're both cutting back." I'd answer, "It has its own menu again." I think we'd share a quiet smile, understanding, without saying so, that relationships change with seasons, whether they involve neighbours, old congregants, or creatures that leave 4 pointed signatures in the mud. That summer, Devon came to tune the piano again. As he worked, I flipped through my notebook, its pages filled with dates, titles of pieces, and small observations. At the back, in a shaky hand, I'd written a sentence that surprised me. Some hungers are not meant to be solved, only honoured. I couldn't remember which night I'd scribbled that down, only that it had felt true. When I played for Devon to check his work, the instrument sounded warmer, more open, as if the wood itself had grown used to the new arrangement of our lives. The house no longer felt like a stage for some eerie ritual, but like a place where routines had gently overlapped until they fit together without effort. I did not listen for steps that night. I played for the sheer pleasure of feeling the keys answer me. Years have a way of slipping by when measured in seasons instead of calendars. Snow, thaw, green, gold each cycle, stitching another ring into the tree line behind the house. Another layer into the story I tell myself about who I am in this place. The piano aged with me, its walnut finish softening, its keys bearing a little more wear where my fingers favoured certain paths. My hands changed, too. Some mornings the stiffness was so bad that I had to wrap them around a warm mug for a long time before daring a scale. On those days, I played shorter pieces, fragments of hymns, the simplest progressions. I thought often of Harold's early warning, of the question everyone had asked in their own way. What happens when you can't play anymore? The answer, like most true things, turned out not to be a single moment but a series of adjustments. Our visitor, if I can still call it that, grew older as well. I saw it less frequently, but when I did, the power in its stride remained unmistakable. A scar appeared along one shoulder, pale against the mottled coat, the story behind it known only to the woods. It moved with the same contained confidence, the same habit of pausing just beyond the edge of direct light. By then, the pan lived mostly under the sink. I brought it out only during the harshest cold snaps, when snow lay deep and crusted, and even the crows seemed quieter. On those nights, I did not pretend indifference. I put food out, played the old pieces, and accepted whatever came. Sometimes the prints appeared, sometimes they didn't. We were both, I sensed, less beholden to the arrangement than we had once been. One autumn, my niece Claire came to stay for a week, escaping a noisy city and a job that seemed to demand more of her than it gave back. She arrived with a suitcase, a laptop, and a pair of headphones slung around her neck. On the second evening, she stood by the piano, amused. A real one. She said, not just a digital keyboard. I laughed. She's more real than I am on some days. When I offered to teach her the lullaby, Claire hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers were quicker than mine, though less patient. She stumbled on the timing at first, rushing the gentle turns of the melody. But soon she found the pacing, letting the notes breathe. The house seemed to swell with attention. Even the clock on the mantel felt as if it were listening in a new way. Again, I said softly when she finished. She obliged, settling into the rhythm. On the second run-through, a faint sound floated in from the yard, a step, a shift of weight, so subtle that Claire didn't notice. I saw the fleeting shadow at the edge of the back window, the familiar suggestion of tufted ears, the stillness of something that knew it was being heard but not seen. I did not point it out. Some things I've learned are richer when discovered slowly, if at all. Instead, I let my gaze rest on Claire's hands, marvelling at how easily the music moved through her, how the piece I'd carried for so long already knew how to belong to someone else. In that moment, the worry that had hummed under my days for years, what happens when I can't play, loosened its grip. On her last night, we played together, 4 hands sharing the keys, the lullaby, the waltz, the simple student piece, Mr. Lambert had once taught to children whose names I'll never know. Outside, leaves scraped along the porch in little dry swirls. No steps came, but I didn't need them to. The bond that had started with hunger and habit had grown into something quieter, a shared understanding that some threads, once woven, continue whether or not we tug on them. Even now, on clear winter evenings when the sky turns that deep blue just before full dark, I sometimes pause mid-phrase and glance toward the glass. Every so often, there it is, a shape at the edge of the yard, pausing, listening. I can't say for certain it's the same animal anymore. Time changes us all. But the tilt of the head, the stillness, the way it seems to breathe with the music, those feel familiar. We tried everything. I might tell the curious, changing foods, shifting times, adding distance. even flirtations with silence. In the end, what remained was simple. I played. Something listened. Hunger. On both sides of the glass. Found its own strange balance, not erased or cured, but answered, for a while, by the steady, human thing my hands could still do on evenings when the house and the woods leaned in together to hear. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.